Tom Ficklin Show on WNHHLP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning, everybody. And Harry, again, thank you for that intro. Byron Haskins is a friend, and that's kind of the intro to a song that he's created. And I just love he shared it with me last week, and I just love the melody. It kind of relaxed me and make my heart beat I think a little more peaceful. And we need peace like never before, I think, in these days and times. And in fact, we're going to talk today about how do you create peace in your heart, peace in society, peace in the world. And if that sounds too global, we're going to talk about how you can kind of take care of your heart and how you can not just rest and remain kind of unaware of the importance of how medical research, of translation, of data, of community health, just the heartbeat of society is something that is so important in this day and time. To be more specific, we have Dr. Eric Valazquez with us. Dr. Valazquez has asked me to address him as Eric, but Dr. Valazquez, I guess it's when I read your background and the number of years that you've been involved with this, I guess it gives me a sense of conveying the respect. But I appreciate the fact that I can refer to you as Eric, and we're going to chat about community health, cardiovascular health, heart failure, and also genetics. Just before Dr. Valazquez talks more about his background, I just wanted to share that given this day and time, there's so much, unfortunately, and I'm putting my judgment on public record, the unfortunate negative discussion about research and taking advantage of research and participate in research and whether we can take the flu and whether we can take the vaccines. Folks, let's remember if I said Linus Pauling or Jonas Salk or Madame Curie or even Charles Drew, think about the people that have been, the benefits that we have taken for granted in this day and age because of people that are passionate like Dr. Valazquez in terms of research and knowledge and also sharing and applying the knowledge. So Dr. Valazquez, Eric, welcome to the Tom Ficklin Show. You said this is your first time chatting with me, and this is my first time chatting with you. So we'll get to know one another as well. And many of the cultural ambassadors on the call, I believe you're already familiar with. So that's a good thing. So welcome and good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing this morning?
I am doing well. It's a beautiful day here in New Haven, and this is a critically important topic that I am excited to discuss with you and the team here and your audience.
So let's jump right in terms of what you're up to, the community benefit, not only now but for unborn generations. I mean, everyone on this call knows someone that has had a heart attack or has had a stroke. This is so key as your role as Chief of Cardiovascular Medicine for Yale Medicine and the Yale New Haven Hospital.
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll start by just introducing you to my role and what I feel are the pillars of the responsibility I carry with my colleagues. We exist first and foremost to deliver outstanding innovative care to our community. And our community at Yale is not only the community of New Haven and the regions aligned with it in Connecticut, but our responsibilities to the community at large, be it nationally and internationally, in working in partnerships. Secondly, and I do put this in no in particular order other than to say patient care always comes first, is that we have a responsibility to define how therapies that are delivered to patients work, to make sure that they're effective, and to innovate and define the therapies of the future. So we are research intensive and focused in delivering the future care today. And the third, which is, again, in no particular order of importance other than to say that without this, we have no future, is we are responsible for educating the next generation of clinicians and physicians and nurses and staff who will be able to care for patients into the future and continue to expand their level of knowledge. So I take all those roles very seriously, and I'm very fortunate to be at the crossroads of those responsibilities. Now, let me speak a little bit and try to make this, as I mentioned to you earlier, real, and personal. Um, you know, I am a mid-50s gentleman in the United States. Um, it wasn't so long ago where my projected lifespan may have been measured in years, and now that is no longer the case. That's not true for everyone, and that is something we have to evaluate and understand. But certainly, the progressive changes in life expectancy are clearly linked to improvements in cardiovascular health.
That's right.
Cardiovascular disease remains not the most important, but certainly the most. But the disease, the syndrome of diseases that causes the most morbidity and most mortality in the U.S. More people die of cardiovascular disease than any other general cause of disease. Now, what do I mean by cardiovascular disease, and why have we seen this increase in longevity just in decades? And it relates to a few big topics, I would say. One is our ability to manage high blood pressure. It wasn't so long ago, and I'm going to date some people in the audience potentially. In the 1950s, it was only then when we started developing therapies that we consider standard now, like diuretics. And the management of blood pressure in the 1950s was really in its infancy. In fact, there was arguments whether managing blood pressure was even important, particularly in patients who were getting older. Now, move forward, 60, 70 years. Now we have not only diuretics, but we have multiple classes of blood pressure medicines. We've established goals for blood pressure where we're not saying, well, only treat if you're symptomatic or your blood pressure is over 180. But now we clearly know that if you treat to a target of 120, the systolic, which is the top number, versus a target of 140, people live longer and do better, free of heart failure and heart attacks, and actually even free of dementia. If you can treat to a lower blood pressure. So think about that, just 5-6 decades. Number two, coronary artery disease. What do I mean by coronary disease? That's the atherosclerosis or that affects that causes blockages of the arteries that feed the heart. And that when they're blocked, they can lead to heart attacks. Our ability to identify those risk factors, cholesterol, blood pressure, others, inflammation, we're just learning more and more about. We may have new therapies targeting an even another different pathway, has absolutely revolutionized the care of coronary disease. At the same time, we've developed technologies that have helped us manage patients who present with acute heart attacks. I can't speak to the specifics, but I had the pleasure of being on service at Yale New Haven Hospital over the last week. I just finished last night. So 7 days of being here working with our team and our fellows and our trainees and others, taking care of patients who came in through the emergency room with an acute heart problem. I'm not going to name a 90-plus-year-old person walked in, otherwise doing well at home, enjoying life at that age with her family, and with a heart attack, where there was clear evidence of ongoing damage to the heart. And within a matter of 90 minutes, our team was able to diagnose, bring that patient to the catheterization laboratory, open the artery that was blocked and preserve her heart pump function so that she could be discharged the next day. I mean, that think about that. In the 1970s, we couldn't do that. And now we do it routinely. So the treatment, not only in terms of preventing risks of coronary disease, but treating it and then preventing acute heart attacks so people don't die of something that is now treatable in their 50s or 60s. It typically could have affected, although I mentioned an example of a 90-year-old woman who is probably not working out of the house anymore. Most of the tragedies you hear are of young men and women who present of sudden death, who had a heart attack, maybe that led to a blockage, and so we have to talk about how important it is to get the treatment quickly if you have symptoms. So I'll get back to that in a moment. Third, I mentioned high blood pressure, coronary disease, heart failure. So heart failure is, in a way, it's caused by both blood pressure and coronary disease as the key major causes. But when I talk about heart failure, I mean the inability of the heart to pump blood to the rest of the body without symptoms of shortness of breath or swelling. The heart can be weak or it can be too stiff. There are many different factors, and I can't get into all the details. We've learned tremendous things about the genetics underlying the risk. But many of the risk factors that I've already mentioned, blood pressure and coronary disease and atherosclerosis, cause heart failure. And our ability to treat that with medicines and prevent progressive weakening of the heart muscle and those symptoms, has really, I would say, been, game changing. And the last maybe bucket, I guess, of diseases I talk about is arrhythmias. So atrial fibrillation, or arrhythmias that can put people at risk of sudden death or of symptoms of shortness of breath or palpitations. Our ability to prevent those with medications and then treat them if they come up. Again, we now have it wasn't so long ago that pacemakers didn't exist. If you had a slow heart rate, you would die. But now that's not even, you don't even have to need to stay overnight sometimes. You just come in, you have a slow heart rate. If it's diagnosed in time, you put a pacemaker in if it's appropriate. And then that individual who would otherwise have just had loss of consciousness and died because of poor, not sufficient pump function, because not enough triggers to rhythm generations in the heart. Now we know how to treat that. So what I'm hoping to share with you based on this kind of is where we are now relative to where we were in the past is, in a way, is a tremendous success story. Now, and that is simply due to innovation, testing therapies, patients being willing to enroll into clinical trials where the therapies that were maybe designed could be confirmed as effective. Because just as many times we've succeeded in confirming something, we've failed in thinking that we had a really great idea that made sense biologically. But when we tested that idea in patients, we didn't have the same effect. It was not effective therapies, so costly but no value, so we don't want those. Or they could put people at harm's way because our understanding of biology and the biology underpinning disease is imperfect, and it will always be imperfect. We'll always be learning. So I don't foresee a future without us as a community being patients, families, or investigators coming together to involve each other in studies where we can test whether a therapy really works. And maybe this is maybe I'll take a break after I say one more thing. I cannot stress how important it is to test those therapies in studies which represent us. And what I mean by us, well, if you do a study only in men, women's biology may be different. Their response to a therapy may be different. The dosing of the medication may be different. Their ability we would never think twice about excluding women from studies that affect in diseases that affect them. The same can be said for different ethnic and races. Now, it may not be genetics, it may not be fully explainable by biology, but there are different socio-demographic factors at play, different, that we just need to understand how therapies affect us as a community. And if we don't enroll representative patients in the studies, and then we approve those studies, and then they become part of the treatment plan, we've done ourselves a disservice and potentially put patients who weren't studied at risk because we don't know for sure. So I think it's just so critical for us to get the message out that we've made. We have a lot to be proud of, but a lot more work to do, and we need to continue to do that work by being effective in explaining what we do, why it's important, getting the word out, and in having patients and their families join the investigative community in moving forward. So I'm going to take a breath, and then I have some good personal stories to give you a sense of where things are, but I wanted to maybe let you, Tom, just kind of maybe guide me where we want to go next.
No, well, great, and you're a good co-captain. We're joined, as you know, Dr. Valazquez, by some of the Yale Clinical Center for Investigation Cultural Ambassadors, and Reverend Leroy Perry and Ray Anderson and Reverend Elvin Clayton and Sunday Black. Would one of the four of you like to kind of pose a follow-up question or query to Dr. Valazquez based on what he's mentioned thus far?
Yeah, I'd like to ask the doctor, what are the research studies now that we might be able to help with recruitment in regards to the hypertension, heart studies that you may be currently doing?
Sure. So, I think the answer, Reverend Perry, is there's almost too much to talk about, but I think it's a wide display. I think there are, to use hypertension as an example, we have several studies that are looking at how we disseminate information and implement known therapies more effectively in different communities. So I think it is not necessarily, that would be an example of a study where we may not be defining a new therapy, but just trying to say, well, how, we have therapies, how do we effectively implement them so that they produce the effect in the population and in individual patients that we need? Because that's one of the sad truths, is that the translation between a discovery and an innovation and even a guideline direction to physicians, and when that is actually being applied in a large proportion of the population at risk, that translation takes way too long, sometimes decades. And I think that is one of to me, a very sad truth that we have to address and conquer. So I would use that as an example. Implementation work. Hypertension is bad. What do we know? Does our community know that? What can we help them? How can we define mechanisms to inform them more effectively so they're willing to work with clinicians in addressing it? And then how do we get medications and diet and nutritional and exercise therapies to them in ways that they are willing to remain adherent and compliant with them to affect their that's real research that we need to do, and I think addresses issues around that are more, I guess, social cultural, but certainly we need to know. I think another type of research, to address your point, would be more at the level comparative effectiveness. I like to use that term. We have therapies. The question is, which therapy is better? A lot of my research, personal work that I worked on over decades, was taking patients who had heart dysfunction, had heart failure, and had blockages of the arteries that feed the heart, and wondering, and it, until we finished this work, wondering whether surgery to bypass those arteries was more effective than continuing medical therapy and alone. And that was a real question. And there was a tremendous variability in how patients were treated, because there was no evidence to suggest one therapeutic strategy was better than the other. So comparing the effectiveness of two strategies. The result of that was that if you have coronary disease and you have a reduced heart pump function, adding bypass surgery to medicines makes people live longer. That's the quick and dirty answer. There's a lot of complexity to that, but that's the quick and dirty answer. So there's many examples that we at Yale here and in our community are doing in comparing different strategies of care to make sure that we understand which strategy is more effective in reducing morbidity and mortality. Now I'm going to kind of move a little bit more to the discovery angle, right? This is a spectrum, right? So sometimes we don't know why, we know a disease exists. We have a suggestion of why the disease happens, but we don't know how to treat it. We're discovering treatments, or we're evaluating treatments. And those treatments sometimes are compared against placebos, right? Because we don't have a treatment. I'm going to use another example from my own kind of like general area of focus, which is the area of heart failure. And Dr. Perry and Dr. Clayton are aware of some of my interest in this area, but we know, as an example, that many patients who have a type of heart failure have that due to abnormal deposition of proteins in the heart muscle. And that is called amyloidosis. Those proteins are amyloid. So we didn't even used to look for this. Think about this. We have a disease that we knew existed that had been identified in autopsies and other things, and we knew patients had them. But because we didn't have a therapy that could affect it, our approach to actually diagnosing it was perhaps less than optimal. So now, due to discovery work, recent publications, others, that we now have therapies that reduce the deposition of this abnormal protein in the heart. And because of that, people do better. Wow, it's a change, right? So now we're going to have to understand and do research to understand, how do we find these patients more effectively, because we haven't even been looking for them. But that's an example of a therapy, a therapeutic trial, a trial where patients had to, do the very brave thing of agreeing to be part of a study where one group, unaware to the physicians treating them and the researchers and the patients, decided to get treated with this experimental therapy, and another group got randomized to placebo. And that obviously has to be managed very carefully and ethically, which we do. And there's a whole organization nationally, internationally, to help us with that. But those are experimental trials, right? And then the last part I'll just say, and this is not but is what I consider mechanistic or discovery science, where we're looking at molecules. We're in the laboratory. We're at the bench. We're maybe using human samples, but trying to understand the biology of disease in a way that could help us confirm therapies that we then might want to put into people. So we're fortunate that we have scientists and investigators, in my group at the Heart and Vascular Center and in cardiovascular medicine, that span the entire spectrum, from discovery and mechanistic science and studies using human materials, but not on the patient per se. maybe using blood or using cells, to those studies that actually test a therapy versus no therapy, versus those type of studies that test different strategies that might be available, but no one knows which one's better, to how to implement the best strategy so that it gets to the right patient at the right time. So I feel very, like I said, I hope that helps you people understand the breadth of the different types of studies they can get involved in. And everyone has their level of comfort and confidence. And, but there are many different ways people can get involved, I would say.
Eric, just let me just say one more thing, and I'm going to be finished. Two things, rather. One is, it would be great if we could get this information out. So, I mean, what you're talking about now, you know about, but our community is unaware of, totally almost unaware of. We do have a newsletter, and the Ficklin Show is another medium form. But if we could get something out to our churches and our community talking about these studies and making people aware of them, I think we might be able to reach more people in the studies. The other thing is that I'm curious about is, how long does it take for you to complete the study of, like, for example, the lack of proteins and that would cause one to have a heart attack or maybe have a heart attack? I mean, is it 10-year study so that we wouldn't know the outcomes for 10 or 15 years? And how many people would die while we're waiting for this study to run its course?
So I think that's a very important consideration. I think the example that I shared of a study where there's no therapy, but you're testing a novel experimental therapy where the risks are not completely known yet. So you have to, versus nothing. Something like that, depending on what the level of evidence to change practice the FDA requires. I mean, if it requires counting how many patients were hospitalized or how many people died, that study will take much longer, right? But if it requires a change in quality of life or another metric, which you arguably might agree might be acceptable in that situation, since there's no other alternative to treatment, it might be shorter. So it depends. There's a lot of factors there, and I think the community does need to understand these different ways that studies are defined. But let's say that study that I mentioned, where hospitalization and quality of life and other factors were the key components. From initiation, meaning that they have a compound that they want to test that's gotten to a point where the FDA is willing to allow testing. That's a lot of big ifs, right?
Right.
To the completion of a study like that could be in excess of 5 years. And then, but I think that's the only way to move forward. Now, and this is I'm passionate about this. So forgive me if I get a little pressured speech here. What are the key issues that make that translation of a completion of that study longer? The key issues from my perspective is the challenges we have in the US in enrolling patients. And if we have 100 centers that are willing to enroll these types of patients, this is not a very common disease that's been diagnosed. So there's the issue of maybe we're not finding these patients to enroll them. So that's one thing we'll have to address. And then the issue of, and typically one center is considered successful if they're enrolling one patient every 2 months. Well, we can't do that. If we're going to continue to enroll one patient every 2 months in 100 centers and we need 1,000 patients, you do the math, right? And you need a year of follow-up. So that just takes longer. So the one way we as a community can jumpstart development of new therapies that will help our community is to enroll at a faster rate and to get more people aware. That is one thing we have control over. There are a lot of rules and regulations, some may argue too many, that get in the way of doing things efficiently. But they're always done with the best of intentions to protect the population. But I think we have to balance, it helps no one if we have a group of patients who have no therapy, who are suffering, and it takes us 5 years to develop a therapy that now we can find. What happened, to your point, what happened all those years before where we had no therapy, and what happened to the people in the 5 years while we were studying that didn't get access to the study? We need to do better there. So I hope I've given you some food for thought.
Yeah.
I know Dr. Clayton had a question, I thought, but maybe.
Yes. Dr. Valazquez, is there a connection between heart disease and dementia?
You mentioned that.
The answer is absolutely yes. The way it connects is through sharing several risk factors and several diseases that are associated. Several diseases of the heart are associated with increasing risk of dementia. So what are the risk factors? Well, there's a type of dementia that is associated with mini strokes or small strokes, many different strokes. That risk of stroke is not only related, all these are, the mitigation factors are not 100%, right? There's many things contributing, but they're certainly affected by blood pressure control. So the better blood pressure control you have, the less likely you'll have cognitive impairment as you age. That I think is a very large overstatement, but I would stand by it. And so blood pressure control, reduces the risk of stroke, reduces the risk of cognitive impairment, and those two things contribute to dementia. And so I would say yes. So that's a shared risk factor. The other thing that there are diseases, I guess one would be the one we were just talking with Reverend Perry. The abnormal proteins that we see in the heart called amyloid that causes cardiac amyloidosis is also been part of the longstanding perspective associated with dementia. So amyloid fibrils or those proteins misfold and are associated with Alzheimer's disease. Now, there's a lot of work there, and I can't get into the details. I'm not sure it's 100% that it's sure that those proteins cause Alzheimer's disease, but certainly when you have Alzheimer's disease, you have more of those proteins in your brain. So there's this issue of shared risk factors as well as similar biology. Fibrosis, what I mean by that, fibrosis is as we age and maybe accentuated by many other things, our tissues develop kind of a response to inflammation and or injury that they get stiffer and less compliant, and we lose effective mass of working cells, which is replaced by filler. I'm not. That's not a very scientific word, but that's a good way to think about it. That happens more frequently if we have a lot more inflammation. Inflammation affects the heart as well as the brain. There are some fundamental biology that is being explored, and I think from that therapies will come that we'll have to test. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Yes.
May I ask a question or make a statement, I guess? You said so much information, and education is so important, right? And so we know that there's studies that folks need to get involved in, but we need to get more information out as it relates to educating people on all of the causes that could cause dementia, that will affect your heart, your blood pressure. What are those downstream effects? And so for me, it's all about getting that information out, and then also about preventive measures, right? And so how could we help our communities understand, the effects of high blood pressure, right? So when people think they have high blood pressure, they have high blood pressure. They take some pills. They don't really understand the effects of that high blood pressure could have on the other organs in their body, right? And so that educational piece is not there. And I think that you said so much information as it relates to connecting those things and those underlying diseases that come from maybe a high blood pressure that could cause a heart failure, that could cause dementia, tying all those things together and helping people see that just maybe this one little thing that you have of high blood pressure could cause other issues down the road. And so I don't know, how do we get that information out to people and help people understand that? You're on mute, Dr. V.
You said so many important things right there. So I think when you say you have high blood pressure, people see it as something that is an option, right? It's optional. I've got high blood. It's fine. I miss this pill tomorrow. It's okay, you know. But what we need to do is we kind of have to approach it from the perspective of what public health. We can have another conversation. I won't get into that about how the limitation of our public health infrastructure and what we're doing, but I wonder how many individuals know and truly understand and graphically understand the fact that if you can't control your blood pressure, you're at a higher rate of having to go onto hemodialysis because your kidneys fail. They understand dialysis. They don't want that, but they don't know. I don't know if they've made the connection between blood pressure control. Yeah, people don't want to be bedbound because they can't control the fluid that builds up in their lungs and in their legs and elsewhere, and the loss of energy and ability to exercise or do exertion. So they know that heart failure is bad. It's in the word. It's heart failure, but they don't necessarily make the connection.
Right.
That blood pressure control can minimize that. Sudden cardiac death, people have family, friends in the news media. They hear about people who die suddenly of a heart attack or of a sudden arrhythmia, but they don't necessarily make the connection that happened in some part, maybe because blood pressure was not controlled for a long period of time. So it's called a silent killer for a reason. Blood pressure, right? I mean, it's silent because people don't feel it. And I have felt for a while that because we have developed so many therapies, that there's almost a sense of like, oh, it's okay, I can deal with that later. We know that controlling blood pressure below 130 is better to control it better than less than 140. But do the physicians do spend enough time with patients explaining that, or maybe we can't? Maybe we have to say, is it a community responsibility for us to educate people about that? I kind of think that those very effective public health messages where you see an individual who is speaking through a tube in their throat because they're smoked, and there's a connection. That's the cigarette and the tube in your throat and cancer. I feel people need to have that graphic understanding. To the YouTube video of a person who has to spend the morning in hemodialysis and feels crummy large part of their day in their 50s, because in their 30s and 40s they had blood pressure that was very severe, that maybe we failed them in helping them control it. I don't want to blame the patient, because it's not that sometimes the patient's not aware, or they don't we haven't given them the understanding to make those changes. I think it's a responsibility of the community for sure.
Dr. Valazquez, it's really interesting. I just wanted to add, I in prep for these radio shows, I always try to find out what the topic is, and then I go up and look up all these medical infographics, and I start reading and trying to get myself kind of crammed for the radio show. And I think the takeaway I always have is how much time I've spent in educational settings and how little I know about how the body works, what the interrelationship is of heart and things. One of the advantages of getting older, you mentioned you were in your mid 50s. Well, I've got you beat. And I was around in the 50s. So I've one of the benefits of getting older is you know more and more and more people that have had the things we talk about: heart attacks, strokes, you know, uh, diseases, hip replacements, et cetera, et cetera. And I love Sunday's comment because this whole thing of education, but I think so it's so important for us to self-educate. I mean, we have the internet, and it is a key thing for us to kind of self-educate ourselves. The question I would have to you is, what I saw on one of those infographics, it was from the American Heart Association. It said, are you making an effort or are you making excuses? And that's resonating with me. So I guess the question to you would be, given the need for people to educate, probably self-educate, community educate, what are the efforts, what are some of the efforts you would recommend to us and to younger people to take ownership of understanding not just their health, but the whole science of health and how it's related, and you know what they can, how they can use that knowledge to better their lives and the lives of those around them?
You have, it's a tough question, I had to say, and I would say that it starts with at least for me, a recognition that this is not a top-down, approach. That will never work. There's not enough physicians, frankly. There's not enough scientists. So this has to be germinate around us. I guess one of my suggestions, and something that I want to get increasingly involved with, is in fact in providing the resources to help communities, be they religious communities, be they communities that are neighborhood communities, be it barbershops, be it whatever it takes to educate in small bite-sized nuggets that kind of continue to keep the issues in people's minds, right? I think everyone knows about COVID now, right? And I certainly do not intend to politicize this anyway, but I think it's still probably true that more people die of flu, right? But everyone knows about COVID, but no one has. We didn't spend this much energy talking about flu, but flu, particularly affects people with heart failure, people, and we have, and we don't do we're not 100% around our vaccination rate around flu. So I think it's about just keeping the information available to people, bringing them the information from different perspectives. Be it, if you teach a child about blood pressure and they just hear the word and they go home and said, "Hey, Daddy, this blood pressure thing is really bad. Have you checked your blood pressure?" That might be a little trigger that takes a 38-year-old or a 40-year-old who's living a very busy life. And I remember those days, you're taking kids to different places and you're just trying to get the work done and you're trying to advance your own career. That might be all it takes to have that individual go to a nurse at their office or in their work of business, or maybe and get their blood pressure checked. And maybe that 1 out of 5 people says, "Hey, you got to go get that checked out. It's high." Those are things that I think you just need to kind of work at the school age level, at the level of communities, and and we have to all own this. I don't think this can be top down.
Eric, I think that one of the things that the ambassador program can do, we have now implemented young ambassadors because the old ambassadors are getting old. So we've got some young people, and I think that part of the 40-hour training that we do, I think I'm going to ask Tisha if she can include this segment with you talking about this, because I think this is one step that we can make for our group to be able to mobilize having this information of the importance of heart and high blood pressure, hypertension, and how it can affect other parts of the body. I mean, I wasn't aware of this, and I thought I knew something, but I realized that there's a whole lot I don't know, and I really appreciate you sharing this with us today. But I think that ought to be a part, and see, I know Duke has also a program that's a template of our program. And if we can get this through template as a part of the training, we can, through community health workers and through religious organizations and through communities, like you say, and those in the community that we affiliate with, barbershops, hairdressers, CAP agencies, I think we can make a difference in outcomes.
Yeah, I'm going to share. I had the great fortune as part of my career to work in collaboration with partners internationally, some in lower and middle income countries, right? And what that has that's opened my mind to is how we need to provide solutions that are specific to the context within which we need to solve the problem. And so, I don't know, frankly, I'll be very honest, if I had as much of an appreciation of community health workers until I did my work in collaboration with partners internationally. We don't have a culture of that as much in our society here. Because we identify ourselves as higher income countries, right? But there's so much that we've talked about today that really if we could identify young ambassadors, or in fact a program of community health workers to do just screening or education around certain key messages. I think that would be a really big step forward for our country. I think it's not a tradition that we in the U.S. have taken on, but that's something that I think it's not difficult to train, particularly in this era where we have technology-assisted diagnoses, to train individuals and to equip them with an automatic blood pressure cuff and basic information. And we're using blood pressure because that's such an easy one, right? Because we know how bad it is, and we just still continue to fail in our translation of that information to the community. And whether we could put in place young individuals who might be interested in science or medicine careers, engage them in the work of screening or education. I mean, that would be a wonderful project that's measurable. The other thing that I also, at the end of the day, I am an investigator, and so we got to measure what we do. If we don't measure it, we are not going to modify it. And so we need to, if we were going to put something in place like that, we have to understand what the value proposition is, and I think and make sure we measure that so that we can potentially recruit resources, government as well as non-governmental resources, to continue to build on whatever is initiated. So just some ideas, but I think this is a great.
Eric, let me ask you one last question. What about the low aspirin regimen thing? Is that something that we should maybe look at?
So aspirin is interesting. It's I think this is an example of how therapies have to be evaluated within the context and the time. So I think aspirin is getting a new look-see based on what else we know out there, right? Now 25 years ago, there wasn't those things. Aspirin had a different role. What the role of aspirin is across the board, should we put it in the water? The answer to that is no, for sure. Okay, but are there groups of patients who were on aspirin that don't need to be on aspirin anymore because there's no additional benefit based on what else they're taking? That's something we're exploring now, and whether we should expand the use of aspirin, particularly low dose aspirin, to larger populations. I mean, so aspirin, I think, is actually for something that's been around as long as it has, it's appropriately being reevaluated carefully to position it within the context of care today relative to what we knew 100 years ago.
Dr. Velazquez, Harry's going to play the music in about 40 seconds, and I just wanted to hold up my wrist. As you know, all the watches now are the watches, etc., are holding that. But I want to give you the last word for the next 30 seconds, and really appreciate your taking the time out to be with us. You lead over 150 specialists, not to mention the various things that you do each and every day. But any parting words? And I think I'd just like to say that we'd love to invite you back, particularly once we get into the flu season and talk about that more. But
I mean, I guess my parting word is, it's a little bit trite because we've heard it a lot, but we are all in this together. Community, we cannot expand the tools we have to take care of patients, be it without the community. It's impossible to do it. We have to evaluate therapies within the context, within the patients that need them. And so this is where I think the construct of a partnership between investigators and physicians and individuals and families and communities who are going to be part of those studies is so important. And I also want to leave people with the idea that there's not just one type of study. There's a broad breadth of types of study that people can participate in, and everyone should feel comfortable. They may not be ready to be part of an experimental clinical trial where they might get a placebo, but they might be able to contribute in other ways as part of a registry to understand how disease progresses, or how care should be implemented, or maybe to donate blood to understand the biology. So I think we need more broad participation. And I think as we educate people about how clinical research, the types of clinical research we do and what has come from that, we can work together to enhance the pace of discovery so that we don't have people waiting too long for therapies that we discover, later.
Dr. Valazquez, thank you so much. Reverend Perry, Reverend Clayton, Deacon Anderson, Deacon Black, Deaconess Black. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening. And again, Dr. Valazquez, thank you so much. We want to do this again. And,
Thank you.
And link our
Thank you. Very informative.
Excellent.
Take care, everybody.
You too.
This is Harry Droz, and you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, New Haven.